Further teaching seemed likely.
Unfortunately, news of the Mormon missionaries preaching in Indian Territory was learned by some of the locals in Independence, including the Indian agent, who did not know who they were and was concerned about what they were doing. His name was Robert Cummins, and immediately he set out, found them, and ordered them off Indian Territory. That essentially ended the opportunity the Mormons had to preach the gospel to the Indians in Indian Territory.
But what was not unsuccessful was the continued passion felt for the Native Americans. This was a vision that the prophet carried with him to the grave. On several other occasions, he sent missionaries forth to Native Americans. He met with them, and a vision of their future always was part of his expectation for what the Lord would do in the future. Indeed, a revelation announced at the very time that the missionaries were first going forth among the Lamanites. In fact, shortly after the prophet had received the first letter from Oliver Cowdery, he dictates a revelation, which we now have as section 49, in which the Lord promises that the Lamanites shall blossom as a rose, that Jacob shall flourish in the wilderness. This was the prophet's dream to his death, and this was a dream that Brigham and other leaders carried with them into the Great Basin and executed it for decades after the prophet Joseph Smith's death.
Though the missionaries were not able to spread the gospel to the Lamanites beyond the borders of Missouri, their mission was successful. During their short stay in Kirtland, over 100 residents were converted to the church. In December 1830, Joseph received a revelation that the saints living in New York were to gather to Ohio to receive an endowment from on high. For some of the saints living here in New York, it meant leaving not only their homes, but their loved ones as well.
The revelation Joseph Smith received as a part of the January 1831 conference was apocalyptic. It painted a picture of a world in sin, total chaos, that had forgotten God and rejected his promises and teachings. And it commanded the saints to gather out of that world, to reject that culture completely, and literally to move from New York to Ohio. It was a call to gather Israel for the second time, for the first time in this dispensation, as Newell Knight said it. And so Joseph had a difficult job to do at this conference. He was asking people in the name of the Lord to leave their homes and farms and to really change their whole way of thinking about possessions and material welfare and so forth. They were being asked to do a countercultural thing and to start a whole new world. There are some words in the Revelations that show that it's clearly dependent on and refers to Enoch's experience. Joseph had just learned more about Enoch by revising the Bible and giving us what we now have in the book of Moses. And the saints were told by the Lord that they could either in process of time, was the wording of the Revelation, become destroyed, or in process of time, as Enoch did, become Zion. And they had to choose. The Revelation forced them to choose which culture they were going to build and be a part of.
When the revelation came asking the believers to gather to the Ohio, it proved to be a hardship for a lot of the converts. A good example is the Knight family, who lived in the Colesville Township area of southern New York. The Knight family were well established. Father Knight owned a mill, owned a farm. His married children owned good property. And there's a dramatic story of when they had to put their property up for sale and organize wagons and move across New York to the canal and on to the Ohio.
For Emma, it was a particularly difficult parting because it meant leaving her family behind. And that was made more difficult by the fact that they had never accepted Joseph or approved of her marriage to Joseph. And before the couple left, there were harsh words, the kind of contention that makes any family parting difficult. So, with anticipation and yet with great sorrow, Emma loaded into a sleigh with Joseph and Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge and headed 300 miles west to Ohio and a new life with the saints.
Well, if you can imagine making the trip from New York to Ohio, here is Emma, 6 months pregnant, coming by sleigh to Kirtland, a distance about 300 miles. Now, you can just imagine how cold it was, how uncomfortable it was for Emma, but they finally make it about February the 1st, 1831, in Kirtland, Ohio. They arrive in front of the Newell K. Whitney store. Newell K. Whitney had been a merchant there for some years, and the store was built in about 1827. Joseph leaps out of the sleigh. He opens the door, goes to the man behind the counter, and says, "Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man." You can imagine a stranger saying that to you, and Newell K. Whitney says, "You have the better of me, sir. I could not call you by name as you have just done to me." He says, "I am Joseph Smith, the prophet. You prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?" Well, at that point, you can imagine the joy and the excitement of Newell K. Whitney and Elizabeth Ann Whitney, his wife, who had pled with the Lord to send light and truth to Kirtland. And thus Joseph arrives.
After Joseph and Emma arrived in Kirtland in the winter of 1831, other saints would soon follow. In fact, 3 groups would come from western New York, consisting of 3 different branches: the Colesville Saints, Manchester Saints, and the Fayette Saints. And so this group of 68 saints, led by Newell Knight, would come from Colesville. They take the Cayuga Seneca Canal up to the Erie Canal, make their way to Buffalo. We also have the Manchester Saints, led by Martin Harris, that would jump on the Erie Canal at Palmyra, come to Buffalo, and await for the ice to break. And the third group was a group of 80 saints, led by Lucy Mack Smith, Mother Smith, who brought 80 saints from the Fayette area.
The various groups of migrating converts from Ohio to New York all kind of converged together at Buffalo, where they were going to book passage on a steamship and go up the Great Lake and into Fairport Harbor and then south into Kirtland. Well, Lucy tells us about the kinds of chaos that they encountered there. They're hostages there at Buffalo while they wait for the lake to thaw, the ice to break up so they can have safe passage. And of course their prices are outrageous. The rooms and food is scarce for them to find comfortable circumstances. So murmuring and the conditions that produce it are at an all-time high. And Lucy tells us how she exercises faith in this setting. How others are complaining and frustrated that their things aren't going well. She decides that if they would unitedly exercise their faith, that the Lord could easily break that ice and they could go safely on their way. And Lucy tells us how as she does that, the ice breaks just long enough for her boat to slip through and then comes back together and hedges the way of the less faithful saints coming in from Colesville.
They came into port at Fairport. Joseph and Hyrum were there to greet their mother and their family, and it was a very emotional encounter, I would imagine.
It's a terrific story that really captures the essence of the revelation Joseph received that commands the saints to move from New York to Ohio. And it's clear from Lucy's recasting of it that she grasped the meaning of that revelation and the significance of that move. It wasn't just a geographical move. It was a move out of Babylon and toward Zion. They were promised that if they would make the move, they would receive the law and an endowment of power in Ohio, which of course comes to pass.
By the time Joseph arrived in Kirtland, news of his coming had preceded him. Many were interested in meeting him and learning of his religious beliefs. One such couple was John and Alice Johnson, who lived in the neighboring town of Hyrum, Ohio. They journeyed here to Kirtland with their minister Ezra Booth to meet the prophet Joseph.
They began to talk about the New Testament miracles. Ezra Booth probably said, well, here's Alice Johnson, look at her rheumatic arm. She couldn't raise it above her shoulder. Is the same gifts of the Spirit still present today?